Chapter 10. Doctorate in Mathematics, University of Jablonka. Jan already had the Master of Science in Mathematics through the Houston Public Library connection to Harvard University's online studies program, Harvard Online. The University of Jablonka was happy to accept her master's and additional credits toward her PhD in applied mathematics, and Jan planned out her remaining coursework around her current interest: hyperspace. During BTS, Jan had noted the central role that hyperspace, its availability and, more often, unavailability, played in various tactical problems. It was known that transition to or from hyperspace within a vaguely defined system periphery would often result in the loss of the ship attempting it. Why that was so, and what the actual bounds of the system periphery were not well understood. The system periphery of most solar systems was by guess and by golly, with a huge safety margin. The system periphery of populated solar systems within the Commonwealth had been roughly mapped by the brute force method of having robot ships transition into and out of hyperspace at various locations and seeing which ones blew up. No detailed map, or any understanding of why that map was so, existed. Worse, the boundaries of the system periphery seemed to change over time. There was no understanding of why that would be either. What was known was you could go faster in hyperspace than normal space. How much faster was unknown, but it was about 40,000 times faster than normal space light speed. This was a puzzle Jan could not leave alone. She informed Tactical Division of her plans for her thesis work, and they were enthusiastically approved. Jan started with the speed difference. What was special about 40,000 times the speed of light? She plotted various acceleration curves and time dilations as measured by ships in hyperspace, threw out outliers, calculated asymptotes, calculated error bars, calculated arithmetic means. As near as she could calculate from the tiny time dilations seen at the relatively slow speeds ships could attain at 1 or 2 gravities of acceleration, the absolute limit was somewhere between 39,800 and 39,900 times normal space light speed. She played around with various universal constants trying to fit that number. Given that it was in 3 space, she also tried the cube of various numbers and combinations of numbers. 4 pi e cubed, written parenthesis 4 pi e parenthesis cubed, is 39,858. Wait, what? Pi was a geometric constant. That suggested the maximum velocity in hyperspace was related to the maximum velocity in normal space by the geometry of hyperspace itself. Jan was commuting to the campus from Sigurdsson. There was a bus from the base that ran past the campus, and she walked to and from the bus stop across campus to the math building. She wore the midnight blue ship suit and work boots of the CSF that had become her basic wardrobe. She was never hassled on these walks, even though she often returned to Sigurdsson late in Jablonka's 25-hour day, or in the wee hours after midnight. One night, late in the first semester, Jan was deep into the consideration of the geometry of hyperspace on her walk. As a result, she was less attentive than usual. A man, wearing a mask, snuck up behind and grabbed her, and tried to pull her between 2 buildings. Jan broke his grip with contemptuous ease and kicked him 4 times before he hit the ground. She felt the bones break as she carried through with kicks she would have pulled in sparring. The final kick was a spinning roundhouse kick with the toe of her navy work boot to the temple. That kick crushed his temple and spun his head around so hard it broke his neck. He was dead before he hit the ground. Jan left the body laying where it had fallen and continued on to her bus stop, once more mentally working on hyperspace geometry. She did not inform the authorities, either the Jezgra police, the university police, or the CSF. She thought no more of the assault and its conclusion at her hands than she would have of stepping on a bug. The campus newspaper 2 days later had the shocking story of the mugging and death of a university honor student. Later that day, the police received an anonymous tip by electronic message that they should check the DNA of the victim against the DNA profiles of recent rape cases. The entire campus was appalled to discover the well-liked senior undergraduate was a serial rapist who had terrorized the campus for the entire 3.5 years of his attendance. It was apparently an intended victim, and perhaps people who had come to her rescue, who had killed him. When university police tracked the electronic message with the anonymous tip, They found it originated from the account of the senior rape investigator in the university police department. He initially denied sending the message, but then admitted it and took credit for the discovery. The rapist's intended victim was never found. Truth be told, the police didn't look very hard. Jan was hard on the trail of the hyperspace problem. Assume for the moment there were points in hyperspace corresponding to all points in normal space. Assume also all these points were 4 pi e cubed closer together in every dimension. What would that mean? Well, the speed of light might very well be the same. That would set the upper bound of speeds in hyperspace to the value she had calculated. No universe with stars and planets would form in hyperspace. It was somewhat surprising that matter like spaceships could exist there, but they certainly could not have formed there. What else? Jan knew gravitational distortion of space-time was felt in hyperspace. That's how CSF ships navigated in hyperspace, from detection of gravitational curvature from nearby stars. Wait a minute. How strong were the gravitational signatures the navigation system used? Normal space gravitational signatures were tiny at interstellar distances. There had been some measurements of this. She looked up that research. 40,000 times stronger than gravitational signatures read in normal space. Huh. So if normal space gravitational signatures were replicated in hyperspace, but at 4 pi e cubed times the strength in normal space, why would that be? With the points all 4 pi e cubed closer together in hyperspace, the gravitational gradient, the change of gravitational potential per unit distance, would be 4 pi e cubed stronger because the denominator was that much shorter. Hyperspace was therefore much more curved than normal space in the vicinity of large masses. That also explained why ships were lost when transitioning within the system periphery. The gravitational gradient as you approached the star system was 4 pi e cubed stronger than the value where you exited into normal space. The discontinuity in gravitational gradient during transition created shear forces that wrought havoc with the ship. The much weaker discontinuities further out, in flatter space, were still enough to tweak Jan's stomach when the transition was made. The shear forces would be greater the larger the transitioning object was. They would be much stronger for something the size of a spaceship, and ultimately destructive within the system periphery. As Jan continued to work the problem, she also figured out why the system periphery seemed to change over time. The location of gas giant planets, like Earth's own Jupiter, would also affect gravitation and curvature of the system periphery. If you were on the same side of the local sun as the gas giant planets, the system periphery would be a bit farther out. If they were on the other side of the sun, it would be a bit closer in. As Jan worked with the field equations, she came up with a way to calculate the system periphery at any point around a solar system, given the location and masses of its planets, from first principles. She also found a way to modulate the hyperspace bubble CSF ships use to transition from normal space to hyperspace and back to lessen, or at least not make any worse, the shear forces felt by the ship's structure. It took Jan 2 years to finish her doctorate in applied mathematics. Her PhD thesis, on the nature of hyperspace, calculating the system periphery and reducing the stresses of hyperspace transition, was submitted first to the tactical division. It was immediately classified top secret. She defended her dissertation to a panel made up of senior scientists from the navigation, propulsion, and shipbuilding divisions of the CSF. By long-standing arrangement with the University of Jablonka, Jan received her doctorate in applied mathematics for a thesis paper no one at the university was allowed to read. Even its title was classified. Chapter 11. Assistant Tactical Officer of CSS Jeanne d'Arc. The normal career path for Tactical Division entrants was successful completion of BTS, followed by a shipboard tour as an ensign. Promotion to the rank of lieutenant followed. Given that Jan had not taken her first shipboard tour, it was unusual when she was promoted to lieutenant on the completion of her doctorate. That was purely on the basis of time and grade. The assistant head of personnel for the Tactical Division, Rear Admiral Janos Stepik, had explained it to her. It is unusual to be promoted to lieutenant in the Tactical Division without completion of a shipboard assignment, Lieutenant. There are a number of considerations here, however. One is that CSS Jeanne d'Arc needs an assistant tactical officer, and on a battleship, that's at least a lieutenant's berth. Second is that we want to use the Jeanne d'Arc to test the actual system periphery of Valor. We want to do some testing of your techniques to make hyperspace transitions within the published system periphery, but outside the actual periphery your mathematics predicts. We don't want to do that here in Jablanca, because we are planning to keep the actual system peripheries a secret, and there's just too much commercial traffic here, a lot of it under foreign flags, to do that. We want to use the Jeanne d'Arc because battleships are so much tougher, she's likely to survive any, minor miscalculation. Understood, sir. If your techniques test out, and we think they will, we will keep using the published system peripheries for routine navigation through the Commonwealth. If the tactical situation makes the use of the closer limit decisive in an actual combat situation, we will use the closer limit. We think that could be a decisive advantage, especially if it's a surprise. Third is that we don't want to hold up your career. Good ship's captains are hard to find, and you are already on that track given your BTS scores. It's not a promise, but I get paid to read the tea leaves. Understood, sir. Also, understand, Lieutenant, there's no promotion for a line officer beyond lieutenant without a shipboard assignment, and somehow, I don't think you want to become a staff officer like me. No, sir. No offense, sir. None taken, Lieutenant. Dismissed. Back in her room, Jan reviewed the stats on the CSF's newest battleships. As a Cleopatra-class battleship, the CSS Jeanne d'Arc had a total complement, officers and crew, of 2,400. There were 6 crew cylinders arranged around her hull, and each was 30% bigger in diameter than those of the Aquitaine. This gave each deck 70% again the square footage of the decks on a light cruiser like the Aquitaine. There were also 3 more decks in each cylinder. 2 adjacent cylinders were considered topside, and the other 4 were below decks. With 3 times the crew complement of the Aquitaine, but over 4.5 times the square footage, the compartments and crew spaces aboard the Jeanne d'Arc were commensurately larger than on the smaller ship. It even had an engine bouting area in the gym. The Jeanne d'Arc was much more massive than the Aquitaine, and it was also much slower. While its cruise acceleration was still 1 g for crew comfort, that was not at 60% power, but at 90%. She could barely make 1.1 g at full power, where a heavy cruiser could make 1.4 g, a light cruiser 1.7 g, and a destroyer could top out over 2 g. The Jeanne d'Arc also had superior weaponry. 6 battleship-grade beam weapons were mounted on struts protruding from between the cylinders. Jan reported above the Jeanne d'Arc a month after her 17th birthday. After reporting aboard, Jan went with the captain and the XO in the captain's ready room. As she had done her homework, she was not surprised to find Senior Captain Jerry Lutzdorf and Captain Bo Stewart waiting for her. Hello, Lieutenant, we meet again. Yes, sir. It's good to see you, sir. And perhaps you remember Captain Stewart here. Yes, sir. It's good to see you too, ma'am. Lieutenant Childers, or should I say, Dr. Childers, Stewart said. Oh no, ma'am. They'll be sending me sprained wrist and such. Jan looked back to Lutzdorf. I'm surprised to see you two still together, sir. Actually, it's not still. It's again. It has been 3 years, Lieutenant, and senior captains have some prerogatives where selection of personnel is concerned. You'll notice some others from the Aquitaine on board as well. Takahashi, Voipers, Cho. Really, sir? That's great. And it's not really an accident that Jeanne d'Arc was selected for your testing, Lieutenant. Senior captains have some prerogatives there as well. When they asked around for ship volunteers for this project, the XO here and I were enthusiastic. We had noted your career progress. That was nicely done in BTS, by the way. And when we heard it was your mathematical theories that were going to be tested, we sort of held up our hands like second graders and said, pick me, pick me. Jan laughed. That's good to hear, sir. Lieutenant, your work has the potential to radically increase the lethality of the CSF in operations and our abilities to protect Commonwealth planets, at least until it leaks out and everybody starts doing it. You don't need to be stuck with some captain who's lukewarm on the idea and grouses about jumped-up lieutenants. We know better, and we really want this to succeed. That's really good news, sir. And give Fleet HQ credit. They thought it was really good news too. It's pretty easy for a stick-in-the-mud captain to poison something like this. We're not going to do that. It's too damned important.
So why don't you plan on briefing us and the department heads on what we're about on this? On the way to Valor once we're in Hyper?
I'd be happy to, sir.
Excellent. In the meantime, you should report to your own department head, the Senior Tactical Officer, Commander Jurgen Chavez. Dismissed, Lieutenant. Jan had a private berth on the Jeanne d'Arc. It was much larger than the guest cabin she had occupied on the Aquitaine 3 years before. About twice as big, which just meant you didn't have to collapse the chairs when you folded the bunk down, and the toilet had a fixed partition. On ship was on ship, and that's all there was to it. She was stowing her increasing collection of belongings when there was a buzz at the door. She went to the cabin door and pushed the open button. Standing in the hall was Senior Chief Voipers. He had another stripe on his arm, and was that some gray at the temples?
But was otherwise as she remembered him.
He saluted her.
Senior Chief, how are you? Shipmates well met.
Ma'am, Senior Chief Joe and I were wondering if you would permit us to give you a little welcome aboard dinner. Introduce you around below decks.
Why sure, Senior Chief. It would be good to sit and chat a while. Where and when?
How about 1800 hours, ma'am? In the Chief's mess?
Now that was special. No one aboard a CSF ship, not even the captain, was permitted in the goat locker, the Chief's mess, without permission. It was a tradition that went back to Earth's sea-going navies. Jan raised an eyebrow. In the goat locker, Senior Chief? Are you sure I'm welcome?
Well, I'm the leader of the goat locker, ma'am. And your, reputation precedes you. Not just the Aquitaine. Larson, Baker, Nakamura, maybe even a little incident in Jezgra a year or two back. Word gets around below decks, ma'am. No one forgets you were one of us first.
Thank you, Senior Chief. I would be honored to attend.
Senior Captain Lutzdorf and Captain Stewart considered having a dinner to introduce Jan to the department heads of the Jeanne d'Arc that evening.
When they were informed by the Chief Petty Officer who ran the officers' mess there was a welcome dinner for Lieutenant Childers in the Chief's mess that evening, they decided the introduction to the Jeanne d'Arc's department heads could wait until tomorrow.
At 1800 hours, Jan knocked on the door of the Chief's mess. She was wearing a plain midnight blue CSF ship suit without any insignia or indications of rank as she had worn aboard the Aquitaine. Since she was not in uniform, they would not be required to salute her or extend the military courtesies of address due her rank. In the goat locker, their home aboard ship, it just seemed polite.
There were usually about 30 senior Chief Petty Officers on a CSF battleship, with over 100 Chief Petty Officers. When the door opened and she was led into the goat locker, it looked like all of them were present. The aromas of steak and lobster filled the room. And was that chocolate cake she smelled? Oh my. Voipers came up to her, started to salute, and then noted her plain ship suit. He nodded instead.
Hi, Senior Chief.
Here in the goat locker, it's Max, ma'am. Well then, here in the goat locker, I'm Jan. Max? I couldn't, ma'am. Max, in here, we're just old friends and below-deck shipmates. Come on, introduce me to your friends. So Jan was introduced around the goat locker as Jan, and that's how she was addressed all evening.
No chief or senior chief ever showed her anything less than the respect due her rank outside the goat locker, however.
In fact, other officers and crew aboard the Jeanne d'Arc on this cruise would always remember the immense respect with which the diminutive young lieutenant was addressed by all the senior non-coms aboard ship,
most of whom had been in the service longer than she had been alive.
How's our testing going so far, Lieutenant? Lutzdorf asked. Department heads were all present in the captain's ready room for a review of where they were and what they would do next. Jan consulted her notepad. We first made 6 hyperspace transitions each, up and down, at the published system periphery using standard techniques to set a baseline using the stress gauges placed on the ship by the shipbuilding division before we left Jablanka.
We next made the same 12 hyperspace transitions using the hyperspace modulation techniques derived from the theory.
For the softer upward transitions, the modulation techniques reduced the low transition stresses on the ship by 20%. For the more difficult downward transitions, the modulation techniques reduced the larger transition stresses on the ship by 80%. A subjective reduction in discomfort was also reported by crew members. We next performed 24 hyperspace transitions, 12 up and 12 down, inside the published system periphery, at closer and closer distances to the calculated system periphery. Our closest transitions so far have been 3/4 of the way from this published system periphery to the calculated system periphery. Transition stresses increased, but upward transition stresses never exceeded the stresses from the unmodulated transitions at the published system periphery, and downward transition stresses never exceeded 50% of the stresses from the unmodulated transitions at the published system periphery.
So it's working, Lutzdorf said.
So far so good, sir.
All right. What's next?
The general quarters alarm shocked Jan out of bed. She jumped into the nearest shipsuit, zipped her boots on, and ran for the starboard ladder to the bridge.
As watch-standing crew, she was just one level below the bridge and was there in less than 2 minutes. She took her position at the console she used for the hyperspace transition testing. Lutzdorf had just settled into his command chair.
Commander Chavez, status?
Lutzdorf said. 6 point sources made an unscheduled hypertransition on the system periphery. They powered up and began accelerating to Valor at their best speed. CIC makes it 2 heavy cruisers and 4 light cruisers making 1.4 gravities. Looks like a smash and run.
No word from the planetary CIC or Admiral Naguri yet, sir.
Time to calculated system periphery? 90 minutes, sir. Lieutenant Childers, can you put us right in front of them? Right smack in their path?
I believe so, yes, sir.
Do it. Go for 5 light seconds in front of them on their current vector. Show them our bows, and drop us in at their velocity. Commander Takahashi, take your numbers from Lieutenant Childers.
What's that battleship doing swanning out here all by herself? Said Captain Fred Gwinnett, Admiral Hobbaker's chief of staff.
Dunno, Fred. Doesn't matter. That big bastard can't catch us. It's the cruisers around the planet I'm worried about, said Admiral Jules Hobbaker, commanding Brunswick's 3rd Fleet.
That battleship's transitioning into hyper, Admiral, Lieutenant Commander Chambers said from plotting.
All guns aft. If she comes in on us at all, it will be from behind. Full power to shields aft.
The Jeanne d'Arc was completing her flip in the hyperspace bubble to put her less vulnerable bows toward the enemy. Transition available in 1 minute, sir, Jan said.
All right. Hit them as soon as we come out of hyper. Guns free, fire at will.
Guns free, fire at will. Yes, sir.
Full power to shields forward.
Full power to shields forward, sir.
Go ahead, Lieutenant.
Set modulation technique Gamma 5, Janice said.
Modulation technique Gamma 5 set.
Shut down hyperspace field generator per Gamma 5, Jan said.
Shutting down hyperspace field generator per Gamma 5 modulation. Hyperspace bubble dissipating.
Hyper transition 0 mark 0, 5 light seconds, Chambers said.
Evasive maneuvers, Hobbaker shouted. The Jeanne d'Arc dropped out of hyperspace 5 light seconds in front of 3rd Fleet, bows on, and at the same velocity toward the planet. Her guns had been pre-aimed, and only minor targeting modifications were necessary. 3rd Fleet had no forward shields energized, and her guns were out of position. The Jeanne d'Arc fired twice. There was no return fire.
12 hours later, another force of 6 ships transitioned out of hyper on the system periphery on the other side of the ecliptic. They hypered back out 15 minutes later.
Well, clearly what they were trying to do is suck Admiral Nagiri out of position with the first force so the second could come in unopposed, Lutzdorf said.
I think that's right, sir. And when they didn't see the first force and Admiral Naguri had not moved away from the planet, they figured it was a blown op, somehow, and bugged out,
Stewart said.
Exactly. What's also clear is how important this ability is to maneuver in hyperspace inside the published system periphery.
Sir, are you at all worried that we exposed that capability when it is supposed to be so hush-hush?
Nobody out here but us and them, XO.
And none of them went home.
Chapter 12. Captain of the Sensor Tender CSS Clermont. I have to tell you, Lieutenant Childers, that little episode out in Valor got a lot of people's attention. I think it's safe to say that most of the stick-in-the-muds and doubters have become quick converts to your hyperspace mathematics, Rear Admiral Stepik said.
Thank you, sir.
Jan was back at Sigurdsson,
meeting once again with the assistant head of personnel for the tactical division. We have now received authorization and budget to perform large-scale testing and detailed mapping of the calculated system peripheries of all Commonwealth systems for the purpose of tactical advantage in our defensive operations. That's very good news, sir. Indeed. Which brings us back to you. We do not need you to be involved in all this data gathering and mapping. We may need you for analysis or working out wrinkles later, but that's a ways down the line yet, which allows us to concentrate on your career development for a bit. As that trip on the Jeanne d'Arc was only 6 months, you're not yet ripe, in my opinion, for the advanced tactics course starting next month. The standard requirement is a year of shipboard duty, so I've been looking around for a 6-month deployment shipboard for you, and I think I have just the thing. Now, I'll warn you right off, it's not a warship, but I have a 6-month deployment for the sensor tender CSS Clermont to Parchment to do some routine maintenance. She needs a skipper, and I can justify giving you an independent command on a small support vessel for 6 months, especially given your hyperspace work, one that is maintaining sensors at the system periphery. That would bring you back here in time for the session of ATS that begins in 7 months. The Clermont is built on a destroyer hull, so it's normally a lieutenant commander's berth. I checked with CSF Fleet Personnel Division, and they've authorized your promotion outside the zone if you take this assignment. The CSF Science Medal, the Distinguished Service Medal, and the Victorious Action Ribbon didn't hurt in getting that approval. Everyone aboard Jeanne d'Arc had received the Victorious Action Ribbon. Jan received the Distinguished Service Medal for her actions on Jeanne d'Arc that allowed the slower battleship to maneuver to engage the Brunswick fleet. The CSF Science Medal was a late response to her doctoral thesis, once it had been proven in space by Jeanne d'Arc. I realize we're pushing you pretty fast, Lieutenant. We need good heavy ship captains, and I'm willing to break some eggs to get them. There's no experience more valuable for a heavy ship captain, in my opinion, than early command of smaller vessels. But if you think it's too soon for you, there's no black marks for demurring on assignments outside the zone. What do you think? If you think I'm ready, sir, I'm good. Stepek stood and held out his hand. Jan shook it. Well then, congratulations, Lieutenant Commander. Ma'am, we have a hyperspace transition detection off our starboard bows, 010 Mark 015 on the ship at 47 light seconds, Sensor Tech Morgan Pomeroy said. I see it. Are there any scheduled transitions out here for this time window? Lieutenant Commander Jan Childers, captain of the sensor tender CSS Clermont, asked. No, ma'am. She's a warship. Preliminary identification is a light cruiser. Is she one of ours? No, ma'am. She's an outer colony design. No transponder active. Well, that's not good. Let's just keep loping along for a bit. Sound general quarters, maintain profile. The Clermont was on routine sensor placement and updating chores along the system periphery of the Parchment system. She was built on a destroyer hull, but was fitted with equipment and racks for sensor pickup and deployment in place of 2 guns. She therefore lacked even a destroyer's firepower, with only a single destroyer-grade beam weapon for self-defense. Up against a light cruiser, she had no chance whatsoever. They had operated at reduced acceleration and power levels to keep a low profile out here on the system periphery. Any incoming ship would most likely identify them as a small private vessel, a tramp freighter, or perhaps a large yacht, at least initially. Jan saw no reason to change that perception. Yet. The captain of the Tenerife light cruiser TSN Assyrian was surprised to find a vessel so close, and on a crossing course when they emerged from hyper. What is it, Kovorsky? Captain Cyril Antonov asked his sensor tech. Hard to tell, sir. Not warship power levels, could be a small ore ship, or maybe a big private yacht. No transponder signal. Chief Petty Officer Miles Kovorsky said. Great, just great. We're supposed to be on a grab-and-run commerce raid real quiet-like, and we trip over somebody who could potentially identify us later. We're a pretty generic outer colony design, sir, and we haven't done anything to identify ourselves. Can we just let them mosey on by? Antonov's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Linda Ferretti, asked. Yeah, maybe. Let's lay doggo here for a bit. Small commercial sensor suite probably hasn't even picked us up. Stand down our power levels and let's see if we can't just let them on by before we get underway. Status change. She's reduced her power levels. Looks like she plans to let us go on past, ma'am. If we had commercial sensors, we wouldn't have seen her, Pomeroy said. Interesting. Jan motioned her executive officer, Lieutenant Susan Sedana, over. She's definitely up to no good, because if she were just here visiting, all legal and friendly, she would have powered up, not down, and be headed in system, whether we saw her or not. She's here to commerce raid, and we're not big enough to be interesting. But she doesn't want us to be able to identify her. She's hoping we'll just go on by.
That's what we're going to do, though, isn't it, ma'am? Tangling with a light cruiser could be really unhealthy. No. We need to know who's pulling off these raids. Then the powers that be can decide how to handle it. You know, through diplomacy.
Or maybe a little thinning out of their navy in their home space.
But we have to know who it is to do that. So here's what I want to do. When we get to our nearest approach, I want to light her up, then run like hell for the buoy. We'll drop a cluster of sensors in her path, and get a good ID on her as she runs by them. We're nearing our closest approach, ma'am, Pomeroy said. All right. Helm, you ready?
Yes, ma'am.
Chief Petty Officer Klaus Jankovic said. Give the signal, Morgan. 10 seconds. 5 seconds. Now, Pomeroy said. Execute, Jan ordered. Status change. Sir, that freighter has just gone to warship power levels, destroyer class. She's altering course toward the inner system at what looks like her full acceleration. She's pulling over 2 Gs, Kavorsky said. Sir, we're being painted. Damn it. Bring up our power levels, activate shields. Pursuit course, full accelerations. Weapons, stand ready, Antonov said. Well, ma'am, it worked. He's after us, all right. Shields up, active sensors are painting us, Pomeroy said. What's his range? Jan asked. He can reach out about 5 light seconds, ma'am, so we're still too far apart for either of us to hit each other with more than a love tap, and we're faster, but he's going to cut our corner on this vector. Understood. Helm, when he gets within his range, I want you to initiate a random circular zigzag around our base vector, with a period of 3 seconds. Jink us around. We're small and we're fast. It'll make for a rough ride, but let's plan on not being wherever he aimed when his beams get here.
Sounds like a good idea to me, ma'am, Jankovic said.
Pomeroy, deploy the sensor cloud.
We're coming within range, sir, Kavorsky said.
Open fire. He's begun firing, ma'am. So far, his beams are going through wherever we were going to be without the zigzag. Maintain random zigzag. Keep running for the buoy.
She's zigzagging on a random pattern, sir.
When our beams get there, she's changed her position around her base course just enough to dodge them. She's small enough and accelerating hard enough, it makes her really hard to hit, Kavorsky said. All right, let's see if we can't hit her anyway. Guns. Run a random pattern around her base course. Take pot shots and let's see if we get lucky, Antonov said. Clermont shuddered with an impact. They're taking random shots around our base course, ma'am. We took a glancing blow from that one. It weakened the number 3 shield, Sedana said. They got lucky. Rotate us to get number 3 shield offside and maintain profile. What's the status on the sensor cloud? Jan asked. They'll pass through it in the next few seconds, ma'am, Pomeroy said.
Status change, sir.
Several dozen small objects ahead on a crossing course, Kavorsky said.
They're sensor drones.
Damn it. They'll ID us for sure. Can't we move any faster? Got her. Tenerife Space Navy, Mongol class. Man, we even got a picture of her hull number, CC-17. Library says she's the TNS Assyrian, ma'am, Pomeroy said. Excellent, Morgan. Good work. Com, transmit sensor data to Parchment Fleet HQ, Jan said.
She's running for that small asteroid, sir.
Can she be planning to hide behind it? Kavorsky said. That's not big enough.
And even so, at her velocity, she'll overfly it. Keep firing.
I think we got a piece of her there. She rotated to swap her shields. Coming up on the buoy, ma'am, Pomeroy said. Is the Assyrian in range? Jan asked. Yes, ma'am. Just coming within range of the buoy. Lieutenant Sedana, power up the buoy and open fire. Status change. Sir, that asteroid is powering up, Kavorsky said. Powering up? Powering up what? Antonov asked. There had been 0 emissions from the asteroid, so it was unmanned, whatever it was. What could be?
Evasive maneuvers! Hard to port!
The remote control beam mount, what Jan had called a buoy, was an unmanned battleship-grade beam weapon with its own internal power system. The Assyrian had maintained its base course unswervingly since the pursuit began, and the Clermont had its targeting dialed in to a fare thee well. Its first powerful beam blew through the light cruiser's shield and hit her in the bows, skewering the ship down her long axis. The Tenerife vessel started to come apart, and then exploded as her power plant blew up. The second beam torched off the debris. I admit I questioned the utility of dragging that stupid thing around everywhere we went, ma'am, Sedona said. There were times I wondered myself, Sue, but I just didn't like being way out here with our little pop gun and no one to turn to if we ran into somebody unfriendly. And they were just sitting around. No one uses them because they have no maneuver capability beyond their aiming thrusters, so they're easy to avoid if someone knows what it is. When I asked for one, logistics said, sure, why not? Nobody else is using them. Latching onto it and dragging it around from one AO to the next every time we moved on was getting pretty tiresome, but I'm glad we had it along, Jan said. Oh, I think you can count me in too on that score, ma'am. It sure saved our bacon this time. Well, we could have probably just gone on by the Assyrian, pretending we didn't see her, but we wouldn't have found out who was doing the raiding. Parchment Fleet HQ was happy we got a positive ID on her. I predict Tenerife will be less pleased.